After a long time of research and studying in the classroom, I've finally been able to put happiness into perspective. So here's my final project on happiness. So before I go into it, here's some background information on happiness. Happiness was originally known as eudaimonia, the Greek translation for happiness. Along with this, Nicomachean Ethics was written by Aristotle in 350 BCE, which is one of the first times where happiness was actually put into play. People didn't know much about happiness, so Aristotle wrote about it, trying to figure out the real meaning behind it. During the time periods of Aristotle's writings, happiness was the only thing sought after for ourselves. Many people had thought this was the only point of living, and if happiness was not achieved, there was no point of living. After pulling all this information together, the first questionnaire studying happiness was created in 1915 by a philosopher named Webb. Now that the background information is out of the way, there are still questions that stand about happiness today. First question is, what is happiness? Is it defined differently or similar across domains? Second question, where does the level of happiness come from? Is it nature and or nurture? Third question, can someone increase their level of happiness? Does state versus trait happiness matter? And the fourth question, should people strive to increase their happiness? Are there benefits or limitations? All these questions are going to be answered in this PowerPoint. So our first question that's going to be answered is, what is happiness? Obviously, happiness is something that everybody knows about, but is it defined similarly or differently across domains? Is it similarly or different from person to person? So to answer that question for you, it is defined very differently from person to person and across domains. Although it is defined differently from person to person and across domains, everything about it is very similar. Everyone understands the concept of what happiness is, but there is not one set definition for every single person. But there is still that in between that differs from person to person. So here I've written them for you. My first example is taken straight from Webster's dictionary. The dictionary states that happiness is a state of well-being and contentment. My second example is my classmates in my first year seminar of happiness. My classmates came up with an ultimate definition after being in subgroups, figuring out that happiness is actually the feeling you get when you're surrounded by things you love that bring you satisfaction no matter the external circumstances. My last three examples of what happiness is come from three well-known philosophers, Aristotle, Diener, and Veenhoven. Nicomachean Ethics, the book that I had previously talked about that Aristotle wrote in 350 BCE, Aristotle states that a good life is life of excellent rational activity. What Aristotle means by this is that it is self-perception. If you perceive yourself to be a happy person, then you have lived a good life with excellent rational activity, meaning that you enjoy what you're doing and when you're doing it. Diener, like Aristotle, have very similar findings in what happiness is. However, Diener says that happiness comes from subjective well-being. I will go into depth about Diener's meaning of subjective well-being in later slides. Last but not least is Veenhoven. Veenhoven uses his definition of happiness in a later study that I go into. He uses it in the study as a base definition of happiness to find out how to find it. He says that happiness is the subject of enjoyment of one's own life as a whole. As promised, here's my slide on Diener's definition of happiness, subjective well-being. He defines subjective well-being as people's evaluation of their own lives, including both cognitive and emotional components. Going deeper into his definition of subjective well-being, it is actually knowing how you're feeling and the thought process of how you're feeling. In other words, your self-perception, how you see yourself. Along with the definition, subjective well-being is also the balance of emotions and mood resulting in a good feeling. That's what makes up good subjective well-being. Although this seems like a good, accurate representation of what happiness is, there are a few flaws that go into subjective well-being. As stated in the definition, subjective well-being is self-perception. With that being said, it is hard to get a real assessment of how someone's subjective well-being actually is. Studies of happiness and subjective well-being have been flawed due to people inaccurately describing how they're actually feeling. To try and limit these flaws, here are some of the commonly assessed things to find true subjective well-being in these studies. The first bullet point is positive affect. Positive affect refers to one's likelihood of experiencing positive emotions and interacting with others with life challenges in a positive way. On the flip side is bullet 2, negative affect. Negative affect is the same thing as positive affect, but taking everything negatively. The third bullet point that is commonly assessed is your personal judgment. It is exactly what it seems, basically how you perceive yourself and your level of subjective well-being. With all that being said, the question comes is how to assess your level of subjective well-being. Research has been done effectively through 3 different ways, with the first effective way being surveys. Surveys that are both self-reported and someone else who's close to you reporting what they believe your subjective well-being is. Another effective way is experience sampling. Experience sampling seems to be more effective because it comes throughout the different times of the day. In these studies, participants are given computers that have alarms that go off through random times of the day. At this point, they then write down what they're experiencing in levels of happiness. So then, following what happiness is, comes where does our level of happiness come from? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it both? After reading 2 different articles written by Manfred Lenzen and Christina M. Deneve, I figured out exactly where happiness has come from. Although these articles overlap in certain information, they are also very separate in what they are studying. So the most popular example of where happiness comes from is actually in our genetic makeup. A close second for finding where our level of happiness comes from is your personality. Many people are thought to believe to be either extroversive or introversive, also known as neuroticism, and these two are strongly tied to emotional experience. Someone who is extroversive is seen as a people person. These people are socially outgoing and exhibit high sensitivity to reward. Also, these people tend to experience higher level of positive emotion even when they're left alone. On the other hand, someone who is neurotic or introversive is someone who likes to be left alone. These people are prone to experiencing more guilt, anxiety, and depression. Happiness levels are not just based on nature, it's also nurture. Nature was the genetic makeup and the personality. However, for nurture, you have different things that can change your level of happiness. For example, life circumstances, activities, and patterns of thinking. Although your level of happiness is originally coming from your genetic makeup and your personality, it can also be changed over time. There's a strong pull from the nurture that is within you. For life circumstances, for example, a death of a loved one or somebody that was very meaningful in your life can have a strong correlation to your happiness. Another way is your activities that you're doing. People find harmony in different things that they're doing throughout the day and sometimes bring greater level of happiness to themselves. And finally, your patterns of thinking. Some people have a negative outlook on life or a positive outlook on life, which also ultimately could contribute to your level of happiness. These 3 examples can go either way. It's not just positive or just negative. There can be positive life circumstances along with negative, also with activities. Nobody likes paying taxes, so it could bring an unhappy feeling, along with patterns of thinking. Everybody can change how they're thinking. Do you look at the glass half full or half empty? One of the strongest correlations to your level of happiness is your social relationships. Your social relationships are made up of friendships, family time, and romance. To have strong social relationships, which will ultimately add to a higher level of happiness, It seems to be a must to be intimate and trusting of your family, romance life, and your friendships. So, to answer the question to number two, where does our happiness level come from? It comes from multiple different things, like I listed: genetic makeup, personality, life circumstances, activities and patterns of thinking, and social relationships, but also your ability to adapt. So, going back to nature and nurture, there are a few other things. Along with personality traits, which you cannot change, there are emotional tendencies that come from both sides, like I talked about. With the emotional tendencies, you have three different subcategories: emotional stability, positive affectivity, and tension. Going hand in hand with that is your relationship, which are enhancing traits. You have three subcategories for relationships also: affiliation, trust, and social desirability. The third bullet point is the explanation of life. This means the way people are thinking about and explain what happens in their life. Some people have negative outlooks and other people have positive outlooks. People with the positive outlooks obviously have a better and higher level of happiness. Along with your relationships and other things that can change throughout your life, there's more into nurture. Nurture is also going into government and carbon footprinting, pollution, and how the government is spending money. Believe it or not, Manfred Lenzen says that the government actually has strong pulls for level of happiness. Studies show that countries or places with a higher or larger carbon footprint are less happy, along with the amount of pollution. Higher pollution relates to less happiness. Also, in Lenzen's article, they talk about how government is spending money could possibly affect your level of happiness. Some people are not happy with how or where the government is putting their money. So, although we can look into all the nature and nurture that goes into your level of happiness, there are many other subcategories that can potentially affect how you're feeling. So, with all this information being thrown at you, you might be a little worried, especially if you're not happy. But don't worry, things can change. So, the next question is, can you increase your happiness? In my readings of Pursuing Happiness in Everyday Life, the author pulls a quote from King and Napa in 2008, saying that happiness trumps wealth and physical attractiveness. Happiness is central to lay people's belief about what makes life worth living. This then partially supports Aristotle's original thought that happiness was the only thing sought after for ourselves. Although it is not currently the only thing, it is a big thing. So then the question comes to play: can you increase your happiness? To answer that question, yes, you can increase your happiness, although there comes with some caveats. So yes, you can increase your happiness, but the lasting rise in happiness is not possible, and it's due to the next two bullet points: set points and the hedonic treadmill. This set point is said to be a level of happiness that you will automatically refer back to. So, going back to the first bullet point, lasting rises in happiness is not possible. So you can have temporary uplifts, but nothing that will permanently change your level of happiness because of this set point. An example given in class was winning the lottery. Winning the lottery might be very rewarding for most people, and it should be, but after a certain time, your level of happiness will result back to the set point. As for the hedonic treadmill, it is said to be that people will strive to increase their happiness and feel like they're not moving, doing all this work, yet not getting anywhere with it, and not increasing their happiness or decreasing. They're basically running in place like running on a treadmill. So studies have shown that yes, you can increase your happiness. The question is how? So in Park's study in 2012, they list many reasons or ways to become happier, along with studies supporting their findings. So the first direction to look in steps to becoming happier is how happy comparable people are to you. So you look at people that are similar age, similar gender, similar level of health, and similar personalities. From there, you can take steps to figure out how to become happier. In Parks' study, Parks lists off a couple different ways to try and increase this happiness, giving different activities to participants to find out ultimately what is the best way to increase it. The first activity, they challenged participants to remember the happy days, replaying emotions and feelings during a previously happy day through writing. Also, were given the option of using or not using a picture. A second way of becoming happier, they challenged their participants to try and strengthen a social relationship. They told them to contact a close other to revive and or strengthen this relationship in hopes of increasing their happiness. The third way of increasing happiness was goal setting. Goal setting is something we've gone over in class and has been a point of emphasis throughout the course. In the study, they challenged their participants to list different goals that they wanted to achieve. After the people reviewing the studies accepted their goal, the participants then took the initial steps to begin achieving this goal. Similar to strengthening social relationships, gratitude journal was another way of trying to increase this happiness. The participants were then told to write down one thing they're grateful for and reflect on why they're grateful for it. And finally, expressing gratitude personally, which is also similar to the gratitude journal and strengthening social relationships. The participants were asked to contact somebody close to them and express their gratitude to them over the phone. So then, a few more questions to ask yourself before performing any one of these activities. You ask yourself, 1. How have these choices worked out for people? Following that, 2. How have the choices worked out for people who are similar to you? And 3. How have these choices worked out for you once performing them? Then, after answering the questions of how happy comparable people are, and the 3 at the bottom, you should be able to use one of these 4 methods to help increase your happiness. But just like any study, there comes limitations. The first limitation being that people are more likely to seek out happiness during a time of depression. The second limitation is a quote taken straight from the article. Parks states that if happiness is a matter of fate, there is no point in striving for more. Unfortunately, some people have this outlook on life. So after putting all of this in perspective, we now come to question 4. Should you seek out happiness? Are there benefits or limitations? So yes, it is okay to seek out happiness, but what you have to realize is the hedonic treadmill and the set point, which I previously had talked about. Disregarding these two could result in a lot of frustration. Most people don't understand the idea of the hedonic treadmill and the set point, thus making them frustrated and ultimately losing their happiness. In the article Time, Money, and Happiness, the author writes that it is important to focus on the surrounding factors around happiness. Focus on things that do make you happy instead of focusing on happiness as a whole. Focusing on things such as family, your career, what you're eating, and your personal development could ultimately help increase your happiness. If you're looking into how to seek out happiness and how to increase it, you should look into your life choices, look into enhancing your learned skills, your socioeconomic position, your social ties, and reflecting on life events. If these life events are negative, try and put a positive spin on these things. But the most important thing to do while seeking out happiness is to remember not to overdo it. Overdoing it could ultimately result in a decrease of your happiness. Happiness as a whole is one of those things that is just not quite yet figured out by everyone. In life, there are things that make you happy and things that make you unhappy. You live your own life, so it's up to you to figure out what's going to make you happy and what's going to make you unhappy. As a whole, you want to increase your happiness and become the happiest person that you can be. And it's up to you and only you to figure that out. It's not just personal genetics, it's much more than that. So go out and increase your happiness. Thanks for watching.